In 1964, a white tycoon publicly humiliated Bumpy Johnson's wife and daughter on Fifth Avenue, convinced money and race made him untouchable. There was no shouting and no police report, only a line crossed in public. 72 hours later, banks cut ties, partners vanished, and his empire began to collapse. How did Bumpy Johnson erase a man's power without ever confronting him? At 2:47 p.m., Fifth Avenue was operating at peak precision. The street looked polished, orderly, and self-confident, as if nothing disruptive had ever been allowed to survive there. The store reflected the same discipline. Voices were controlled, movements were economical, and every interaction followed an invisible hierarchy that required no explanation. Months earlier, the Civil Rights Act had passed. The law changed signage, but it did not change instinct. In places like this, equality existed on paper. In practice, access was still filtered through tone, timing, and permission. Two black women entered the store without hesitation. Their clothing was tailored, their posture composed, their presence deliberate. They were not uncertain. They were experienced. Several employees noticed them immediately. Not because they caused disruption, but because their presence required recalculation. A glance moved quickly from face to clothing, then to posture. The conclusion was not hostility, but restraint. This was conditional civility. You were allowed inside, but not fully accepted. The store continued functioning. No rule had been broken, at least not one written down. Then a man appeared at the center of the room, and the atmosphere shifted without announcement. He did not introduce himself, and no one asked him to. His presence carried a weight that did not belong to retail. It belonged to reputation, connections, and a history of never being corrected. He did not scan the room adjusted to him. Employees altered their posture subtly. Customers became aware of their own positions. The man spoke calmly. His voice did not rise because it did not need to. What he said was not framed as an insult. It was framed as expectation. He referenced standards. He referenced image. He referenced the type of people the space was meant for. No single sentence could later be quoted as overt abuse. It was the continuity that delivered the message. The women were addressed indirectly. He spoke about them, not to them. The effect was deliberate. It established distance without confrontation. Staff heard everything. Customers heard everything. No one interrupted. No one redirected the conversation. A sales associate glanced toward management, then returned to the display table. A customer adjusted their stance and looked away. The women remained still. Their expressions did not change. They did not respond immediately, not because they were confused, but because they understood the environment. Responding would have turned the moment into spectacle. Silence kept the imbalance visible. The exchange continued longer than comfort allowed. Long enough for exits to exist and be ignored. Later, people would struggle to identify the exact moment discomfort crossed into complicity. There was no sharp boundary. According to those present who later avoided discussing the incident, the most unsettling detail was how ordinary it felt. The store continued operating without pause. That ordinariness was the miscalculation. It made the event feel survivable. The man mistook silence for acceptance. He had made that mistake before and benefited from it. He believed the absence of resistance meant the absence of consequence. Experience had taught him that was usually correct. The women remained composed throughout. Their restraint was not passive, it was controlled. When they finally turned toward the door, no one stopped them. No one followed. There was no apology. No attempt to document what had happened. The system behaved exactly as designed. Outside Fifth Avenue resumed its rhythm immediately. Traffic moved, conversations continued, and the afternoon remained intact. Inside, the man returned to his position. His posture suggested closure, not risk. To him, the moment was finished. It had ended the way moments like that always ended. What he did not understand was that the event had not concluded. It had only relocated. There was no confrontation on the sidewalk. No raised voices, no crowd. That absence would be misread as victory. In reality, something had been registered. Not officially, not legally, but precisely. Memory does not require paperwork. It requires recognition. By the time the women reached the end of the block, the incident had already left the store. It moved without sound. No names were spoken. No instructions were issued. The silence itself functioned as transmission. The man spent the remainder of the afternoon unconcerned. His schedule continued uninterrupted. He would eat dinner that night believing the matter resolved. His confidence remained intact. At 2:47 p.m., he believed he had exercised authority. In truth, he had exposed how it worked. Nothing in the next hours would warn him. No call would come. No message would arrive. The misstep was complete, and it would not be corrected where it occurred. The women did not raise their voices when the exchange ended. They did not ask for an explanation or wait for an apology that had already been decided against. They turned toward the exit with the same measured pace they had entered. Nothing in their movement suggested panic, and nothing suggested retreat. The room reacted immediately, though not with words. Eyes lowered, bodies angled away, and attention shifted to anything that avoided engagement. A customer examined a display that required no inspection. An employee adjusted merchandise that was already aligned. This was not fear in its obvious form. It was calculation. Intervening would have required choosing a side, and choosing a side carried consequences. Silence, by contrast, carried none. No one followed the women. No one asked if they were all right or offered assistance. The door opened and closed without emphasis. The sound was ordinary, and that ordinariness was reassuring. Inside the store, normal activity resumed almost instantly. Transactions continued, conversations restarted, and authority remained undisturbed. No manager gathered staff. No report was initiated. There was no call to the police, not because harm had not occurred, but because acknowledging it would have disrupted order. Order was valued more than resolution. An apology would have required recognition, and recognition would have required accountability. The system preferred neither. Later, when employees were asked why nothing had been done, most struggled to answer. The common explanation was that there had been nothing to document. According to accounts that later avoided detail, even time became difficult to measure. The exchange felt brief to some and extended to others. There was no official record confirming how long the confrontation lasted. There was only agreement that it lasted long enough. Outside, the women continued down the sidewalk without altering their pace. Their silence remained complete. They did not look back. They did not speak to one another. To those watching from behind glass, this absence of reaction confirmed an assumption that had already formed. If there was no resistance, then there was no consequence. The room accepted that conclusion quickly. Relief began to surface in small, quiet ways. People congratulated themselves internally for staying out of it. No one believed they had made a choice. The logic was familiar and comforting. Silence meant safety. What went unnoticed was how that same silence was being interpreted elsewhere. Silence does not dissolve events. It preserves them. As the women moved farther down Fifth Avenue, the incident did not dissipate. It condensed. By choosing not to react publicly, the women prevented the event from being resolved where it occurred. No confrontation meant no closure. No closure meant the moment remained open. The store mistook restraint for submission. It did so because submission was easier to manage. The absence of noise suggested weakness to those accustomed to measuring power by volume. This interpretation felt consistent with past experience. In similar situations, silence usually ended the matter. That expectation was deeply ingrained. What the room failed to consider was where the silence was going. Silence, when carried intact, travels. The women did not seek witnesses or validation. They did not dramatize what had occurred. They carried the incident without embellishment, without urgency, and without emotion. That restraint was deliberate. It ensured the story would not be diluted by outrage or dismissed as reaction. By the time they reached the end of the block, the event had detached itself from the store. It no longer belonged to that space. No one inside noticed this transition. They were busy returning to routine. Routine felt reassuring. Routine felt final. It was neither. Inside the store, the absence of consequence was interpreted as confirmation of hierarchy. Authority had been asserted and order had held. That interpretation was shared by nearly everyone present. They believed the moment had been contained. They believed incorrectly. The silence that followed the women was not empty. It was precise. It carried sequence without commentary and detail without accusation. When repeated later, it would not sound emotional. It would sound factual. The room had expected protest. When none came, it relaxed. What it did not anticipate was recalibration. There was no discussion among staff after the incident. No meeting, no debrief, no acknowledgement. The lack of response hardened into precedent. According to those who later declined to revisit the moment, the most unsettling realization came much later. It was the understanding that choosing not to act had been an action. The store had sided with stability over justice. It had done so instinctively. That instinct carried consequences. By the time the women disappeared from view, the environment had already returned to equilibrium. Music played softly and receipts printed without interruption. Nothing in the space reflected the significance of what had occurred. This contrast mattered. The women's silence had been interpreted as surrender. The room believed the matter settled. It would take 72 hours to understand how wrong that belief was. The greatest error was not the insult itself. It was the assumption that silence ends things. In some places, silence closes doors. In others, it opens them. The room did not know which kind it had created. And by the time it found out nothing it remembered would be relevant anymore. The story reached the apartment without urgency. It arrived in fragments carried by pauses rather than emotion delivered, as if accuracy mattered more than relief. Nothing about the retelling suggested outrage and nothing asked for sympathy. The women did not describe how they felt. They described where they stood, who spoke, and who stayed silent while it happened. Certain details were repeated carefully while others were left untouched, as if repetition itself carried weight. Bumpy Johnson listened without interruption. His posture did not change, his expression did not tighten, and his eyes did not drift away. The stillness in the room deepened as the account came to an end. For several seconds, no one spoke. The silence that followed was not awkward or uncertain, it felt deliberate, as if the room itself was waiting to be measured. When he finally spoke, his voice was even. He did not ask who had insulted them or what words were used. He asked who had seen it happen. The question landed without emphasis. It was not framed as anger or curiosity, but as procedure. Those listening understood immediately that this was not about emotion. He followed with more questions. How many people were present where employees were standing and who entered or left during the exchange? He did not ask what anyone thought. Names were offered cautiously. Positions were described precisely without speculation or interpretation. The women answered with restraint, focusing on sequence rather than meaning. He did not react to the answers. There was no visible anger, no reassurance, and no indication that anything would follow immediately. That absence unsettled the room more than any outburst would have. Those present expected direction. None came. No orders were issued and no warnings were implied. According to people close to him later, this restraint was intentional. It was not hesitation or uncertainty, but assessment. He was not deciding whether to act, he was deciding how not to. The insult itself was not his focus. What mattered was where it happened, who allowed it, and who remained silent while it unfolded. Those details carried more weight than the words used. He did not ask follow-up questions about tone or intent. He did not need them. The language had already been translated by context. The room waited for closure. None was offered. Someone shifted position, assuming the conversation had ended, but no signal confirmed it. Bumpy Johnson stood and walked toward the window. He looked out without comment as traffic moved below and voices rose from the street unchanged and unaware. He did not name the man responsible. Naming would have simplified the situation, and simplification would have been a mistake. Simplicity creates targets, and targets invite confrontation. He returned to his seat without explanation. No one knew whether the meeting was over or merely suspended. That uncertainty began to work immediately. No phone calls were made that night. No instructions traveled outward from the apartment, and no meetings were arranged in response to the story. Nothing happened, and that was the point. Direct confrontation would have reframed the insult as a challenge, and a challenge would have demanded escalation. Escalation was unnecessary. The decision was not announced, but it was understood by those familiar with his methods. Silence was not retreat. It was positioning. According to later accounts, the calm in the room felt heavier than anger would have. It suggested calculation rather than emotion, patience rather than hesitation. Visible reaction would have clarified intent. Clarification would have allowed preparation, and preparation would have reduced leverage. Instead, he allowed the incident to remain unresolved. Unresolved events accumulate pressure, and pressure reveals dependencies. He did not seek immediate correction. He sought imbalance. Correction would have restored order too quickly. The women were not asked what should be done. Their restraint had already dictated the response, and nothing more was required of them. Their silence preserved the integrity of the incident. That integrity would now be allowed to move without interference. He acknowledged them with a nod. No apology was offered because none was required. What had occurred did not need validation. The meeting ended without incident. No voices were raised, no warnings issued, and no one was asked to stay behind. People stood, collected their coats, and left in the same controlled manner they had arrived. There was no final exchange to mark closure. No handshake lingered long enough to signal alliance or fracture, and the room emptied as if nothing unusual had occurred. That absence was deliberate. In that world, immediate reaction drew attention, and attention created problems while silence allowed consequences to form without fingerprints. No one was reprimanded that night. No calls were placed to correct behavior, and no intermediaries were dispatched to explain what had happened. The lack of follow-up appeared intentional. What did not happen mattered as much as what did, and that distinction would become important later. By the next morning, Harlem looked unchanged. Businesses opened on schedule cars, followed familiar routes, and familiar faces occupied familiar corners. On the surface, the machinery of the neighborhood ran as it always had. Nothing suggested interruption or adjustment. Beneath that surface, communication began to thin. Phone calls that once received immediate responses were left unanswered, and messages were acknowledged, late if at all. Those expecting reaction waited. Waiting unsettled them because silence in that world rarely meant nothing. It usually meant something was already moving elsewhere. Bumpy Johnson did not move against a man. He positioned a situation. He did not challenge power. He exposed how dependent it was. The insult on Fifth Avenue had been public. The response would not be, and that distinction mattered. By choosing not to react, he removed the option of escalation. What remained was consequence, and consequence does not require announcement. It only requires time, and time in this case had already begun to work. Hour 1 passed without visible change. No meetings were announced, no statements issued, and no reaction reached the street. To anyone watching closely, the silence looked like hesitation. By the second hour, the stillness began to feel intentional. Phones that normally rang with urgency did not ring at all. Schedules continued as planned, but attention quietly shifted. The first movements did not look like action. They looked like routine. A bank officer reviewed a file already approved, then set it aside without explanation. No instructions accompanied the delay. The file simply did not move. Within the first 12 hours, similar pauses appeared elsewhere. A partner postponed a call that had been requested weeks earlier. A meeting was pushed to an unspecified date, then quietly removed from the calendar. Nothing was canceled. Nothing was denied. Everything was deferred. By the end of the first day, the pattern became noticeable to those accustomed to momentum. Responses slowed. Confirmations disappeared, and assurances were replaced by neutral acknowledgments. No one explained the shift. The language was careful. Phrases like routine review and temporary reassessment replaced commitments that had once sounded firm. None of it violated policy. None of it required justification. At no point did anyone reference retaliation. No threat was spoken and no demand was made. The process moved entirely within acceptable boundaries. According to later reviews of correspondence, no single message could be identified as decisive. Each one appeared reasonable in isolation. The power of the response came from accumulation. 24 hours and lawyers began asking questions that did not sound like accusations. They framed them as compliance checks, reputation safeguards, and precautionary steps. The questions carried no urgency. They did not need to. Civil rights organizations began making inquiries framed as clarification. They asked about policies, not people. They asked about standards, not incidents. Each inquiry was legitimate. None suggested coordination. By the second night, the effect reached beyond paperwork. A planned introduction did not happen. A recommendation that had been assumed was quietly withheld. No explanation followed. No follow-up was offered. Inside Harlem, nothing outwardly changed. Businesses opened and closed on time and familiar routines held. On the surface, the neighborhood gave no sign of involvement. Beneath that surface, communication continued to thin. Calls were returned late, if at all. Messages received polite acknowledgments that led nowhere. Those accustomed to immediate access began to notice resistance without opposition. Doors were not slammed, they simply did not open. At the 36-hour mark, the absence of clarity became its own signal. Uncertainty unsettled people more than confrontation would have. They waited for someone to speak first. No one did. According to individuals familiar with the period, the most unsettling aspect was how ordinary everything looked. There were no headlines, no rumors, and no visible escalation. The response did not announce itself. It embedded itself. At no point during these hours was a command traced back to Bumpy Johnson. No document, call log, or witness connected him to the unfolding slowdown. That absence was not accidental. It was structural. Those who later attempted to reconstruct the sequence found only fragments. Decisions were made independently guided by risk assessments rather than instruction. Banks cited internal policy. Partners referenced brand alignment. Advisors spoke of exposure. No one mentioned Harlem. No one mentioned the store. By the second morning, the cumulative effect became undeniable. Projects stalled without explanation. Conversations lost momentum. People who once moved freely through systems encountered friction they could not name. Still, nothing illegal had occurred. No rule had been broken. Every delay could be justified. This was not punishment, it was insulation. At the 48-hour mark, attempts were made to regain footing. Calls were placed to reassure, clarify, and reestablish confidence. The responses were courteous but non-committal. "We'll circle back" replaced certainty. No one said no, no one said yes. The lack of resolution created pressure. Pressure exposed dependency. Those accustomed to authority discovered how much of it relied on cooperation rather than force. Cooperation once withdrawn did not need explanation. By hour 60, the silence began to feel irreversible. Not because damage had been declared, but because momentum had been lost. In systems built on speed and access, delay functions as denial. According to people who later examined the aftermath, the turning point was not a single decision. It was the realization that no decision was coming. At 72 hours, the shape of the outcome was clear. What had once been assumed was now uncertain. Nothing dramatic had happened. That was the most damaging part. No one could identify an enemy. No accusation could be made without evidence. The response had remained entirely within legal boundaries. Every action could be defended. The system had not attacked anyone. It had simply protected itself. From the outside, it looked like coincidence. From the inside, it felt coordinated. The distinction did not matter. The effect was the same. By the end of the third day, the imbalance was complete. Confidence had eroded without confrontation. No warnings had been issued. No ultimatums delivered. The calls that mattered most were the ones never placed. The conversations that would have restored order never occurred. In the absence of noise, consequence settled in. Nothing in those 72 hours could be traced to a directive. No evidence suggested orchestration. According to later reviews, that lack of traceability was the defining feature of the response. It left no fingerprints. It left no record. It left only result. The shift did not announce itself. It appeared first as friction, then as delay, and finally as absence where certainty had once existed. Those who relied on momentum noticed it immediately, even if they could not yet name it. Banks were the first layer to move, though nothing in their actions suggested urgency. Credit lines were not terminated. They were reviewed, paused, and subjected to procedures that had always existed, but were rarely invoked. The language remained professional, neutral, and entirely defensible. Files that had once moved in days began taking weeks. Requests for clarification multiplied without accusation. Every question sounded reasonable on its own. No bank cited an incident. No memo referenced Fifth Avenue. The changes arrived framed as internal prudence rather than external reaction. Partners followed next, though none admitted to following anyone. Meetings were postponed, collaborations reconsidered, and endorsements quietly withdrawn. Each decision was justified by optics rather than morality. Phrases like brand alignment and public sensitivity replaced commitments that had once been unquestioned. No one accused anyone of wrongdoing. They simply recalculated risk. Projects that depended on trust stalled first. Trust once shaken proved difficult to restore without explanation. Explanation was not forthcoming. No single partner could be blamed for the retreat. Each withdrawal looked independent even as the pattern became undeniable. By the time advisors began offering unsolicited caution, the direction was already set. They spoke in hypotheticals and worst-case scenarios, careful never to name a cause. Their role was not to accuse, but to protect. They recommended distance, not confrontation. Distance required no justification. At the same time, the press began circling without circling. Reporters did not publish exposés or allegations. They asked questions. The questions focused on policy history and accountability. They avoided individuals and emphasized systems. That emphasis made them difficult to dismiss. Articles appeared framed as broader examinations of access and exclusion. Names were omitted. Locations were generalized. Readers recognized the implication without being told. The absence of specificity sharpened it. Alongside the coverage came lawful demonstrations. They were organized, permitted, and carefully documented. Their messaging emphasized standards rather than punishment. Signs referenced fairness and transparency. They did not demand retribution. That restraint widened participation. No speaker mentioned Bumpy Johnson. His name did not appear on signs in articles or in statements. That omission was deliberate. Naming would have personalized the response. Personalization would have narrowed it. By keeping the focus on systems, the pressure remained diffuse and persistent. Diffuse pressure is harder to confront. On paper, none of these developments were connected. Banks conducted reviews. Partners reassessed strategy. Journalists investigated patterns. Activists exercised lawful rights. Each action existed within its own domain. Each could be defended independently. Together, they created an environment where association became costly. Cost, once introduced, altered behavior quickly. Those affected searched for a source they could address. No source presented itself. There was no meeting to attend, no individual to persuade, and no threat to counter. The usual tools of influence failed because there was no target. Attempts to push back produced polite responses. "We understand your concern," replaced agreement. "We'll revisit," replaced action. Nothing overtly hostile occurred. That was the most destabilizing part. By the middle of the week, the retreat reached a tipping point. Opportunities that required collective confidence evaporated. Confidence does not survive prolonged uncertainty. Still, no rule had been broken. Every institution involved acted within its mandate. This was not an attack. It was insulation. According to later reconstructions, the most effective element was plausibility. Each participant could honestly claim independence. Coordination was unnecessary. Risk assessment did the work. Reputation management finished it. Those watching from the outside saw coincidence. Those inside felt alignment. The distinction offered no relief. As momentum slowed, attention turned inward. Executives questioned advisors. Advisors questioned assumptions. No one found an answer that restored certainty. The absence of accusation prevented rebuttal. One cannot refute a concern that is never stated. In this environment, silence became confirmation, not of guilt, but of vulnerability. By the end of the period, the system had completed its turn without acknowledging it. Doors were not closed, they simply stopped opening. No announcement marked the shift. No authority claimed responsibility. On paper, the consequences were unrelated. In effect, they were cumulative. The imbalance created during the first 72 hours now widened. Recovery would have required consensus, and consensus was gone. Those affected began to understand the cost of being adjacent to controversy, even unnamed controversy. Distance felt safer than defense. The system had not judged anyone. It had protected itself. In doing so, it demonstrated how power actually moved, not through force, but through refusal. The most damaging aspect was the lack of recourse. Without an accuser, there could be no confrontation. Without confrontation, there could be no resolution. By the time this reality settled in, the reversal was complete. Confidence had eroded beyond repair. Nothing in the record would later prove intent. No document would connect the dots. According to those who reviewed the aftermath, that absence of linkage was decisive. It ensured the outcome could not be challenged. The system had turned away from a name without ever saying it. And once turned, it did not look back. The change did not announce itself to Vincent Gigante. It arrived as resistance without opposition, absence, without explanation, and silence where deference had once existed. For a man accustomed to immediate response, the delay felt unnatural. He did not receive threats. He did not receive warnings. What he encountered instead was something more destabilizing. Doors that once opened without hesitation required reconsideration. Conversations that once moved quickly now stalled before they began. The familiar rhythm of influence began to slip out of sync. At first, Gigante treated the slowdown as coincidence. Systems lag, people hesitate, and timing sometimes works against expectation. He had survived enough cycles to know that patience often resolved minor disruptions. But patience did not restore what was missing. The silence held. He tested his reach carefully. A message was sent through an intermediary who expected acknowledgement, not resistance. The response came late and carried no commitment. Another contact produced the same result. Polite language, neutral tone, and no urgency. Nothing suggested defiance. That was the problem. Gigante searched for a rival. Power as he understood it always came with an opposing face. Someone benefited when influence weakened. This time, no face appeared. There was no gang moving in on territory. No rival family claimed advantage. No meeting demanded explanation. Without an enemy, there was nothing to confront. He considered escalation and dismissed it quickly. Violence requires clarity. It demands a target, a reason, and an outcome. Here there was none. Any visible response would have exposed his position without guaranteeing effect. Exposure without leverage was not strength. He asked for assessments. Advisors spoke carefully, choosing words that reduced risk rather than named cause. They described optics exposure and shifting tolerance. No one suggested retaliation. No one advised confrontation. According to people familiar with the period, this hesitation was not fear. It was uncertainty. The system that once absorbed and legitimized his authority was no longer doing so automatically. Influence had begun to require justification. Justification was not something Mafia power handled well. Gigante explored legal avenues and quickly found them closed. You cannot litigate silence. You cannot subpoena hesitation. No contract had been violated. No agreement had been breached. Every institution involved acted within its rights. The idea of retaliation surfaced briefly and vanished just as quickly. Retaliation requires a visible offense. Here there was none. Any aggressive move would have forced attention onto himself. Attention would have invited scrutiny. Scrutiny would have exposed relationships better left unexamined. He understood the risk immediately. Acting would have clarified the narrative in ways silence had not. For the first time in years, restraint was not strategic. It was necessary. Gigante waited for signals that never came. No phone rang to restore balance. No meeting offered reassurance. The absence of correction felt intentional. According to later accounts, there is no evidence that Gigante was warned in advance. No message alerted him that protection was thinning. The realization arrived gradually, not as shock, but as erosion. Authority was still present, but it was no longer reinforced. Reinforcement once gone is difficult to replace. He attempted to lean on reputation. Reputation depends on recognition. Recognition in this moment was precisely what the system avoided. The lack of acknowledgement denied him the ability to respond. You cannot address a problem that refuses to identify itself. This created a paradox. The more he pushed, the more he risked exposure. The more he withdrew, the more authority faded. Either path carried loss. The traditional tools of power proved ineffective. Fear had no object. Negotiation had no counterpart. Even intimidation requires an audience willing to be intimidated. That audience had disappeared. Those who once adjusted their behavior preemptively no longer did so. They waited for instruction that never came. The waiting itself became the message. Gigante observed the shift with growing frustration. The silence did not insult him, it ignored him. Ignoring power diminishes it faster than challenge. He recognized the imbalance too late to correct it. The environment had already recalibrated. The system was no longer reacting to him. It was reacting around him. That distinction mattered. Without confrontation, there could be no victory. Without victory, there could be no restoration of authority. Everything he considered doing would have required acknowledgement from the very systems now refusing to engage. According to those who later studied the aftermath, this was the point of no return. Once legitimacy withdraws force cannot replace it cleanly. Force creates evidence. Evidence invites consequence. The erosion continued quietly. Influence narrowed, access thinned, and certainty evaporated. Nothing dramatic marked the decline. No arrests were made, no headlines announced a fall. The absence of spectacle preserved the outcome. Gigante's power did not vanish overnight. It thinned layer by layer until it could no longer move the way it once had. He remained physically present. His name still carried weight in certain rooms, but the system that once magnified that weight had stepped back. Power without amplification is fragile. The most destabilizing realization was not loss, but isolation. Without allies willing to act automatically, every move required calculation. Calculation slows power. Slowed power invites challenge, yet no challenge came, only distance. The silence that had once protected him now worked against him. By the time the shift became undeniable, the options were gone. Any attempt to reassert dominance would have required exposure. Exposure would have invited consequences far worse than decline. The system had not attacked him. It had simply stopped carrying him. On paper, nothing tied these developments together. No document linked cause and effect. That absence made the outcome permanent. According to later observers, the defining feature of the collapse was restraint. Not his restraint, but the system's. By refusing to react, it rendered reaction useless. There was no gunfire, no public confrontation, no dramatic reckoning. The power faded without sound. And when it was gone, there was no moment to mark its passing. Only the quiet understanding that it would not return in the same form. They returned at the same hour. The clock inside the store marked nearly the same minute, precise enough to feel intentional rather than coincidental. Nothing in the space acknowledged that time had passed, yet the air carried a different weight. The storefront looked unchanged. The displays were identical, the lighting unchanged, and the quiet confidence of Fifth Avenue remained intact. What had shifted was not visible until they crossed the threshold. The women entered without hesitation. Their pace was steady, their posture controlled, and their expressions unreadable. They did not scan the room for reaction. This time the room reacted anyway. Eyes did not turn away. Shoulders did not angle defensively. The recalibration happened instantly and without discussion. An employee stepped forward before protocol required it. The movement was cautious, measured, and unmistakably intentional. No one waited to see who else might act first. There was no greeting that referenced familiarity. There was no acknowledgement of history. There was only attention. The tone had changed. It was not warm, but it was alert. Questions were asked that had not been asked before. Preferences were noted instead of assumed. Space was offered rather than enforced. Nothing in the exchange resembled an apology. Nothing suggested repair through language. Repair here took a different form. Management appeared earlier than necessary. Not to explain, not to justify, but to observe and ensure compliance. Their presence was corrective rather than welcoming. Staff adjusted behavior in small, precise ways. Voices lowered, postures straightened, and movements became deliberate. The women were no longer being assessed. They were being accommodated. No one mentioned the earlier visit. No one referenced confusion or misunderstanding. The past remained untouched. That omission was not forgetfulness. It was policy. The room behaved as if a line now existed and had already been crossed once. That knowledge shaped every interaction. Customers noticed the difference without understanding its source. The atmosphere carried tension, but not hostility. It was the tension of awareness. The women browsed without interruption. They were given time rather than scrutiny. Assistance arrived only when invited. When service was offered, it was framed as professionalism, not surveillance. That distinction mattered. According to those present that afternoon, the difference was immediate and unmistakable. It was not theatrical, but it was complete. No voice was raised. No authority was asserted. Authority this time was cautious. There was no explanation for the change. None was required. In spaces built on hierarchy, behavior communicates faster than words. The women completed their business without delay. The transaction moved smoothly without complication or pause. Receipts were printed promptly. Packages were handled with care. Everything functioned as it always should have. No one thanked them for returning. No one offered acknowledgement of restraint or courage. Those gestures would have personalized the moment. Personalization would have invited questions. The store did not want questions. As they prepared to leave, no one followed them with their eyes. Attention remained professional, contained, and controlled. The exit passed without ceremony. Outside Fifth Avenue appeared unchanged. Traffic moved, conversations overlapped, and wealth continued its familiar display. Yet something subtle had shifted beneath the surface. Those who had witnessed both visits understood the difference immediately. They did not discuss it openly. According to people who later spoke carefully, there was consensus without coordination. Everyone agreed something had changed. No one agreed on when. The second visit did not feel like triumph. It felt like correction. There was no satisfaction in the room. Only compliance. Compliance, when it arrives without demand, signals recalibration. The absence of apology was more revealing than any statement could have been. Apologies imply guilt. This change implied awareness. The store had adjusted not because it wanted to, but because it understood the cost of not doing so. Costs had already been calculated. No names were mentioned. No events were connected explicitly. On paper, nothing linked the first visit to the second. In practice, everything did. The system had learned where its exposure lay. Exposure alters behavior faster than threat. The women did not linger. They did not test the boundaries of the new tone. They did not seek confirmation. They left as they had arrived, composed and silent. That silence, once misread as surrender, now functioned as confirmation. According to those who witnessed the return, the most striking element was restraint. On both sides, the store did not overcorrect. Overcorrection would have drawn attention. Instead, it normalized respect. Normalization was the point. No statement was issued. No authority announced reform. No lesson was articulated. Yet behavior had shifted in a way that required no enforcement. This was not progress in the celebratory sense. It was adjustment in the practical one. Somewhere between the first visit and the second calculation replaced assumption. Assumption had been expensive. By the time the women disappeared from view, the lesson had settled. Not loudly, but permanently. There was nothing left to say. Those present would later struggle to explain the change without relying on inference. Officially, nothing had happened. Unofficially, everything had. According to those who reflected on the moment years later, the power of the response lay in its invisibility. No one had been punished publicly. No confrontation had taken place. Yet the result was undeniable. The city had adjusted its tone. Not just in that store, but in how it understood consequence. The return did not demand justice. It demonstrated it. That demonstration required no witnesses willing to speak on record. It required only memory. The women did not need acknowledgement. The change itself was sufficient. As they left Fifth Avenue behind, the system remained intact, but altered. Alteration once internalized does not reverse easily. The second visit closed what the first had opened. not with resolution, but with outcome. According to those who witnessed both days and agreed on one thing, the most important moment was not the insult. It was the silence that followed it, and the way that silence, when allowed to travel, taught a city how to behave. No one was hit. No one was arrested. There was no revenge that looked the way history usually expects it to look. What followed did not resemble justice in motion, only justice settling. A man who believed power had to be displayed learned that some boundaries in Harlem never needed enforcement by violence. They were guarded by reputation, by memory, and by a system that knew when to withdraw its protection. Power did not collapse that week, it was simply no longer carried forward. Two women walked out of the same door they had once exited in silence. This time, the silence belonged to the room behind them. Respect was no longer a request, and no one asked why. According to those who later avoided revisiting the details, the most unsettling part of the story was not the insult itself. It was the absence that followed it. No threats, no warnings, no public reckoning, only consequences arriving without announcement. That is how authority truly shifts. Not when someone is defeated, but when the world quietly changes how it behaves around them. By the time anyone realizes what has happened, resistance is no longer an option. In New York that year, power did not need to raise its voice. It did not need to explain itself. It simply waited and let silence finish the work. If stories like this matter to you, the ones history never recorded cleanly, where silence shapes outcomes more than violence, subscribe to the channel. These are the moments that never made headlines but changed cities. Do you believe real power comes from force or from knowing when not to act? Tell us in the comments which silence in this story stayed with you the longest.